everybody to Nonprofit Office Hours. This is, for those of you who haven't been here before, this is an open question and answer session about nonprofits using Salesforce. And we have a great panel of experts who I hope you can now see, who have come to join us. But on the last Friday of the month, we tend to do something a little bit different. So we have a theme for the session. And our theme today is both kind of specific and wide, and could lead us to some interesting conversations. But we're going to talk about integrations and synchronizations. And so the idea of these themed sessions, we still want your questions, but we are, because we've got this topic, we're going to probably talk a little more just generally. So feel free to just listen in and see what you can learn. And if you don't have a question right now, you may indeed get a question from some of what the panel is saying. So if you do have a question for us, feel free to put that into the chat window, and then we can monitor the questions as they come along and call on you for more detail or answer them where they come in the conversation. So integration. Well, it's a big and could be very kind of complex topic. And it's kind of interesting to know where to start with this topic, isn't it, panel? So I kind of wondered where would you start? Because I think this is something that people struggle with, maybe when they're new in the Salesforce world. It's like, well, what is an integration? And is it something that I need? So would one of you like to take a crack at just kind of giving us a brief, well, what is it? And what would you, how would you answer that?
I would ask a different question, Caroline. I would ask, when people say to me, I need to do integration, the first question that I say is, why do you need to integrate? Because people always want to integrate. Because they say, oh, it's great, we want to integrate. And it's like, okay, what's the use case? Why are you integrating? And there's usually a good use case, but I think you have to ask why, because otherwise you just kind of go down the rabbit hole of everyone wants real-time integration immediately. And it's like, well, I'm not sure that's what you need. That's not probably realistic. So, I think there are good reasons. There's like, I think Geraldine Gray had a good slide about it saying integration is about bringing data together so that you and your team don't work in silos and can see what's important on one screen or in a single set of reports. And I think that is a good definition of sort of the rationale behind integrations. But then I think you have to kind of get into what's the use cases for those so that you can then say, well, okay, what are our options?
I was thinking of it also from a different level as well, and I was thinking, well, there's that question of why do you want to do this in the first place, and what efficiency is going to be gained in your organization by employing what a integration would conceivably do for your organization. But the truth is that for me too, like I look at it from the lens of when an organization makes a commitment to an integration, then my next two questions are, what data is actually meaningful to you in this integration? Because I've seen some substantial problems through the years where it's like we're just piling this stuff in Salesforce for no particular reason because we thought it was a good idea. And secondarily, what is an integration and what does it mean to you? Because I get very, very snippy sometimes with third-party developers around what they call an integration and market as such versus what I think actually produces actionable data, to Peter's earlier point about Geraldine's blog, inside of Salesforce.
So where do you think there are good use cases? I mean, where would you expect somebody to say, if you ask the question, why do you need an integration? If they were to say, yeah, we definitely need it, what are the sorts of use cases?
Well, I was going to say we did a thing in our user group about this, and it was the 4 use cases I kind of came up with were streamline the user experience, so make it so they only have to look for information in one place. Remove duplicative work processes, so don't enter data in 2 places. Make data from other systems available in Salesforce, and this kind of, I think, gets into Tracy's point of helping staff make better informed decisions, but it's about bringing the data in an actionable way, just because, I mean, otherwise you get into, well, if it's there, I'm sure it'll make a difference. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. And then just keeping data in sync, so constituent updates their address on a website, maybe in a Drupal website, you want that to be in Salesforce next time you do a mailing. So, and that kind of gets into removing like data in 2 places and stuff. But I think, for me, those are kind of the key use cases. And I think once you begin to drill down into what's, those use cases, then you kind of get into the questions about how often do you need it updated, how are you going to match it, if there's a conflict, who's going to win, which system's going to win, are you happy enough with the storage it's going to take up, and just like how hard is it going to maintain this integration. I think, again, to Tracy's point of, people say, well, we just set up an integration. It's like integrations break all the time. When I build integrations with people, it doesn't matter how good you are, but people will enter systems twice. They'll enter a new email address, and you want to merge it with another one. Integrations are hard, and they'll break. So you've got to kind of think about what's your tolerance to that, and how you're going to kind of manage those integrations, not just on the short term, but over the long term. And are you willing to do that?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I spend a lot of my time talking people out of using, quote-unquote integrations too, because of that reason. It's like, if what you want to see is email deliverability, sure, you can absolutely report on email deliverability inside of Salesforce, but if that's all you need to see, why are you putting that data inside of Salesforce and not just using your email tool for that? And ordinarily, it's that as held against criteria that you need to evaluate with your integration, because I'll tell you, there's some stuff out on the App Exchange where it's like, we've integrated to Salesforce, and the totality of the quote-unquote integration is a visual force page that doesn't produce the actionable data that you need. Sorry, Matthew.
No. But I do want to say, I think, like Peter was just saying, it's not always about getting data back into Salesforce. I think there's some really valuable integrations that are more in the category of not entering data twice. So when you think about email, I think it can be incredibly valuable to be able to send email to a list from within Salesforce rather than having to export that list and import it into your email tool. And whether or not you need particular, results data back inside Salesforce, that can be incredibly valuable, especially if it's done well.
I think you're coming towards something actually that I was going to ask you specifically as a question, Matthew, which is, there's also this difference, isn't there, between kind of integrations which, in a sense, everybody uses, that are usually produced by some third party, and having to do something very customized, which is specific to your organization. Mm-hmm. I think email is a good example. The other one that distracts me is kind of a lot of people use something for payment processing or online donations. That's a kind of common standard integration, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly where to go with that, but yeah, it's definitely true that there are categories of things where good integrations exist, and to my mind, it's worth the trouble to find the good ones and use those if Salesforce is central to what you do. So email and payment processing are 2 examples. I don't think I'd recommend to most Salesforce users that they adopt either of those systems without a good Salesforce integration. But there are definitely others where there may be tools to build an integration, but you're not gonna. If you want one, you're gonna have to build it.
Yeah, and that incurs some technical debt for your organization, because once you build something, you really need to think about how is it going to be maintained, and if your criteria around which it was built in the first place changes, you're gonna need to rebuild your integration if it's a custom integration.
And there are different ways. There are different ways to approach this, aren't there? Because there's the what do you do if you have kind of data that comes in batches or bulk that needs to go into Salesforce, and then there's also these ideas of things that do this sort of real-time connections or synchronizations or whatever. So there's also a bit of a distinction there, I think, isn't there? Could one of you speak a little bit to maybe some of the things that kind of do a synchronization, perhaps more than integration? And Matthew, thank you, Matthew, for pointing out here. As we're chatting, because I'm kind of hoping that somebody in the audience will have a question that we can respond to that is specifically about integration, which we will definitely deal with. At the moment, there's a bit of chat going on here because I see we're getting a few questions from people that aren't specifically about our topic for today. So I think if you're just asking for a quick question about, say, the data wizard, Dennis, I see you've put a couple of things. We'll try and deal with those in chat because they're sort of aside from the topic that we're discussing. But if you have questions about tools that integrate or synchronize or connect in some way with Salesforce, then please feel free to also put those into chat, and we will respond to those actually by talking about them. So that would be great when we get some. So I don't know, Tracy, you're beginning to take the data loader and demand tools into.
I've just been answering them as they come up because I have fun with that, but you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I suppose this might take us in a direction because actually data loader, it is one of those tools that you could conceivably use if you wanted to do some integration. I think Peter, I remember you're a kind of wizard on how you might use the data loader to get data into Salesforce and do a certain amount of automation around it, actually.
Right, I mean, so like one of my hats is I do work with KnowWho that does advocacy data, and up till now, we have used the data loader every night with a lot of customers. It's fully automated and it pushes a lot of data in. And the nice thing with the data loader is like that external ID thing. So say you're pushing data in from the system, then as long as that ID and you can match that up, you kind of get into the unique key challenge. So if you're pushing data in, it will just kind of reference it and it will make that update for you without you having to kind of do the matching. So if you're using that external key, the data loader, I mean, there's other tools do that, some of the online versions, but you know, the external ID is your friend when you're really getting into that data load. And you know, I think you can with the data loader, you don't have to kind of go fully automated. You can have it so that you kind of, maybe somebody sends you a CSV or a spreadsheet once a week from another system. You can set it up so at least you just kind of press a button on your desktop and it loads the data in. And so that's why I think I do think with integrations we get a bit hung up on, well, it has to be this immediate, real-time, straight, you know.
Right.
But often you don't need it. Like if you're going to be doing, you know, some reporting once a month, you don't need that data in there. Or maybe you just need it to come in nightly. Maybe you need it to come in once a week. You know, I think often good enough is more than, yes, it would be nice to have everything done immediately, but I do think that, you know, with data loader and some of these other tools, you can set them up so they're pretty automated without having to sort of, you know, go to all the expense of making it fully automated. So I think those tools can give you a lot of flexibility without having to kind of, you know, spend huge time and effort making them fully automated, because that last 10% could take far more effort and doesn't really deliver much benefit.
Yeah, and I mean it's that really tininess that you're talking about, Peter, that I push back on a lot, because where I've seen, honest to the goodness, like the most advantageous real-time, quote-unquote, integration I've seen from many, many organizations is just dealing with online donations. And it's mainly because, a lot of administrators don't have the time or inclination to get invested into data loader to do all of that matching, to just upload donations, and, but do you need to see everything in real time? No. Does real time even deliver on the promise of real timiness? Not always. And at the end of the day, folks go crazy spending a lot of time wondering when data is going to come over from these tools, after they've supposedly invested in a real-time integration, and in some cases that investment wasn't even necessary in the first place.
Right, I'd also say on the question, data wizard versus, say, data loader workbench. The key there is that the non-profit data wizard is going to help you with the matching. So you can set up those rules. So it's kind of a flat table. It just says, so if you're coming in from, another system that gives you like a flat CSV of especially donation tools, but other tools as well, where you kind of get the contact name, email, maybe some ID, but then also the donation information and maybe a link to something else. If you're trying to do that through data loader, that's tough because you're going to have to split it into the right objects. Or, whereas the data loader, it's given you that kind of flat object, you push it in and then it takes care of the matching. It takes care of putting all the data in the right place. So again, it gets into the use case of data loader is great for getting a lot of data into one object fast, or two objects where maybe they're related. It gets tough if you have to try and say, well, these 4 columns are contact, these 6 columns are donation, and these 3 columns are the event. Then data loader is you can kind of do that, but that's a more complicated process. That's where something like the wizard is going to help you out because it's going to take care of that complexity. But if you just got a bunch of transactional data, like a bunch of orders or a bunch of email transactions, you just want to push them into a transaction table, data loader, and like with the bulk API and stuff, you can move a lot of data really fast. So that's kind of, again, it's kind of what's the use case and what's the complexity of the data you're trying to load. Is it relatively simple, one object, you're just trying to get it all in? Or is it a more complicated set of relationships that you're trying to get right in your organization? Because if that's the case, then I think you push it into the data load object, into the wizard object in non-profit starter pack, and then let that take care of the complexity.
And there are some other more generic tools, aren't there? I mean, Jitterbit and some of the other things, there are tools that are designed to help with that structuring of the data, aren't there?
Yes, and those definitely have a role in more complex integrations, and as well as being able to handle more complex transformations, tools like that also have some nice administrative features, right? So it's really easy to schedule things. You get a log of what occurs. It helps for troubleshooting problems and stuff like that.
And can you talk a little bit about some of these other things like maybe Workato and Zapier and some of these connector tools? Because they're not really designed for pushing large amounts of data to and fro, are they?
No, yeah, those are more for taking single things that happen in one system and triggering something to happen at that time in another system. We rarely use those personally for clients. We use them for ourselves, right? Like we have various things set up in Zapier for, if this happens in in our project management system, make this happen in Salesforce or something like that. But most of them have, unless you start paying money, they have limitations on how many ways you can integrate things and what volume you can do in a time period. Yeah, and it's usually one record or row at a time.
So we had, I will go back and look a little bit at there. There's a question, Bryn, thank you for asking and bringing back this topic. We've had a couple of questions which are specifically about integrating with the nonprofit starter pack, because people are concerned about their account model and what impact that has on integrations. Can anyone talk a little bit about things you need to think about if you're a nonprofit starter pack user?
I would offer that, with a nonprofit starter pack, there has been a lot of talk this year in particular about like the new household account model, but in the end of the day, if you're relying on the nonprofit starter pack to simply create a household account for a contact, generally a lot of tools that I've seen that are sort of in the sort of free and easy or simple kind of quote-unquote simple integration tools, they barely acknowledge the existence of the account record inside of Salesforce, except for the fact that they'll occasionally want to link a contact to what Salesforce considers a more standard approach, and that is like my name at my organization. But at the end of the day, I think if you're using something simplified, you can often rely on the nonprofit starter pack automation around households to monitor that, because your tools are really going to be looking for contact record matching, which gets you in the game mostly of figuring out whether or not you've got duplicate contact data. And I think Bryn's question about like we are using, sometimes a person with a household and sometimes a person with an account that is not a household is going to very much, be governed based on the type of tool you're using to integrate in the first place, because something like demand tools can handle everything as an extraction tool, but something like vertical response integration, they're not going to see your account records at all. So it depends on which tool you're using and why you're using it.
Yeah, I'd say the things when we're evaluating an integration, the things we look for having specific compatibility with starter pack are things that involve payments opportunities. There's a somewhat of a particular data model there that you want to hopefully match, especially when it comes to things like recurring payments and whatnot. But if your integration is mostly concerned with contacts, then I totally agree with Tracy. Most of the time, it'll just work, and the automation in the nonprofit starter pack will handle taking care of. We'll create an account for you when you need one.
Yeah, and that would certainly be true of stuff that touches on campaigns and things as well. And so again, you can deal it with things very much at the contact level, can't you?
Yeah.
Yeah, with forms assembly though, I know we're trying to stay away. I think we're trying not to be product centric, but in the case of trying to build a web form where it's company and contact coming in, in some cases it might be a household, but in other cases a household member, but in most cases it's going to be company and contact. And the logic to build that out is harder than if it's a household model.
Correct, so, because you're matching on the company names and people will type in all kinds of stuff.
Right. We're actually matching on, no, I totally get what you're saying about if it is a donation or a payment. That's kind of where I'm leaning towards too, is that if I'm integrating with a donation package, I'm going to look to see if they can support the MPSP household model. But if I'm looking at something more from a broader, like a webinar or a conference attendee kind of situation, I may look at a product that kind of can be ignoring the household model and look at it more from the generic contact company level. I'm actually thinking that we'll rework our integration with our conference vendor because of that reason. I'm having to go back manually and revamping everybody who's coming in as household members or household accounts and changing them to actually be a contact company relationship instead. So.
Got it.
Yeah.
Also, something to be cognizant of is there are integration packages, and I think you kind of alluded to it, where they say they are NPSP household model aware, but they really aren't because they're only looking at the email field. They're not taking into account that there could be 3 email fields that comes with NPSP, and that's something I think people have to be cognizant of when they're evaluating integrated non-custom integration packages.
Yeah, that's a good point. And the other gotcha you get into is that in a lot of systems, email is the unique identifier for a person, right? In a lot of systems, email, you can't have 2 records with the same email. And of course you can in Salesforce. So sometimes we've run into issues, even with published integrations, that don't really acknowledge that in Salesforce you can have that duplication of email addresses.
And it's funny, Bryn, to your point about the email fields in general in Nonprofit Starter Pack. A lot of the AppExchange integrations will tell you they can handle the Nonprofit Starter Pack because they understand something like the household account model or the one-to-one model that predated it. But the thing about matching on the Salesforce standard email field that is kind of important for a lot of folks is that when you're dealing explicitly with email vendors, it's usually a CAN-SPAM compliance issue for them to not be able to read the other email addresses. Like one of the requested functionalities I get from time to time is, well, if it sends back the email at the standard Salesforce email field, can it send it to one of the other email address fields on the record? And generally a lot of people will be like, no way, because that's breaking CAN-SPAM. But when you're talking about more generally matching based on first name, last name, and email of any integrated tool, the other issue is that those fields that the Nonprofit Starter Pack introduces are very much pertinent to a very small segment of a much bigger market. So, they're not going to necessarily have an inclination to want to build around those because at the end of the day, other companies to whom they're selling may actually already have their method for handling that too. So one of the things I wind up encouraging a lot of organizations to consider is, particularly in a multiply integrated environment, is the Nonprofit Starter Pack automation around the email field can in some cases affect and or break your integration tool's synchronization to that record. So, sometimes I suggest making that field read-only and turning off the workflows that populate it based on preferred email status. In other cases, we build rules around when the preferred email can change on the contact record. So some of that has to be solved from a business process perspective, largely due to how the AppExchange and integrations are handled in the first place.
Yeah, Peter or Matthew, do you have anything to comment on that? Because email is used so frequently, isn't it, as a way of matching up contacts or contacts particularly.
Right, with email integrations and that email being the primary key, that's always a problem when someone changes their email address. That typically you have to kind of, you have to do something which says either don't let it happen immediately or flag it and keep track of the old email address, because otherwise what happens, I've certainly seen this with Eloqua, and I think this is true with the Exact Target, is that you change, someone says, I've changed my email address, and then if you change it, then you lose all the history tracking of the other system. So I think the moment you kind of start building integrations out, you have to be kind of cognizant of what do I need to capture in Salesforce that is going to cause problems with my integration. So I saw an email yesterday from someone about they had an integration with a Drupal website, and they were like, yeah, it's fine, except when you merge contacts in Salesforce, then it deletes the ID. You don't really know anything about it. It just gets merged. So suddenly they've got 2 contacts sitting in their Drupal website, and they're like, oh, well, we need to know which one survived, which one went, And how do we do that? And they were like, well, they're going to probably have to build maybe some sort of trigger to capture that. They're going to have to keep track of the IDs and then kind of have a processing table. And, that's why to the matching question, I'm a big fan of like staging tables. Anyone who's ever seen me build an integration will know I obsessively build staging tables. So I'm building an authorized.net integration for someone right now. And yeah, you can like put in authorized.net, you can put a URL, and every time someone makes a payment, it gets pushed into Salesforce. And could I process that immediately, real time? Sure. But I'm asking for trouble if I do that. My approach is, no, what we do is when it gets pushed, it goes into a staging table, we just capture the raw post, and then maybe, in an asynchronous transaction, or maybe just in a batch, then we can run through it and say, all right, do we have a match for this contact? Do we have a duplicate potential match, in which case flag it? Do we have a recurring donation, in which case how are we going to handle it? But create that staging table so that you've got the same thing we're talking about events. I would say bring it in, have the data, and let the process take care of these 80, 90%. I know what to do with them. I have one email, I have an email in Salesforce, I'm good to go. But for the ones you don't, you want to have that transaction. It's all about the error handling. Getting it right for the matching and all these other things is fine for the 80, 90% of the time, maybe it works. It's the 10% when it doesn't work, which is going to take up all your time, all your staff time, and that's the bit that's going to cause you pain. So that's why I'm a big fan of, whenever you're doing these, if you get the opportunity, push it to a staging table or push it to the nonprofit starter packs, like batch data load table or something like that, and then, you can kind of run it, ignore the stuff that works, and just focus on the stuff that isn't working and see if you can improve those processes. Because otherwise, the worst thing is if you can't trust the data because you don't really know what happened, then people start doubting what they see in front of them, and then I think the integration becomes actually a cost rather than a benefit.
Peter, your point about error handling is like super, super important because I I know a lot of developers who will tell an organization in specific, oh, no worries, we'll just build an integration for that and we'll just, custom write some stuff and it'll be fine. And I'll never forget, I was at a presentation once and I literally jumped down this poor guy's throat because he said that as an answer to a question. And I said, wait a minute, it's not that simple. And if you're telling organizations that building an integration from scratch is simple, you're doing them a disservice, not because it can't be done, but because of that criteria, the error handling criteria of when things become mismatched or multiple values start populating fields or data merges wipe out specific record information. So yeah, that's a cautionary tale. Like, that's actually very real, is if organizations out there are hearing from a developer, oh, that's easy, I'll just build you an integration, that person's telling you a lie, flat out a lie. It's not that easy. Integrations are a lot of thought and process mapping and a lot of error handling conditions. Sorry, I get really persnickety about this.
Yeah, I will say we've encountered a case where, right now I'm trying to, it's post-migration of a new system, and I'm trying to, I'm doing cleanup in Salesforce, and I'm merging records because I'm encountering duplicates and I'm merging records. But now it's kind of come to light. In most cases, it's not problematic because the two records being merged either have the same email, or one of the records doesn't have an email and the other one does. But there have been a few cases where we had somebody coming back going, hey, I'm getting multiple mailings from you guys. It turns out this particular individual was in our system originally with two different emails. When I merged the records, they merged down to one email, but our email, we integrate with an external email software package, and that integration didn't know how to handle that merge. I mean, so that integration, as far as it's concerned, when I merged the two records, it did not delete. So we have an orphan, basically, email subscriber record in the email in the integration email, but so we see two there, but we see only the one in Salesforce because it didn't know how to get rid of it.
Yeah, that's a common problem. I agree with everything Tracy and Peter have been saying, especially like I think you brought this up, Carolyn, earlier that there's integrations that are sort of syncing, which is I think mostly what we're talking about, where there's data on both sides and it needs to be kept in sync with each other versus integrations that just make something happen from one system to the other and don't necessarily pass data back and forth or keep it in sync. But when you do have a syncing system, I think the things that have come up, both like deleting and merging records and also changing data that it might be using as the primary identifier, those are often problems that can occur. And I would actually encourage people to just, if you're thinking of adopting something like that, and certainly if you have adopted it, I think you want to know what that behavior is, right? So I would encourage people to find out what happens if you merge a record in Salesforce and there's still two records in your other system, or what happens if you change that email? Does it handle it gracefully or not? And sometimes, you have to have a procedure that if we're going to, I've seen setups where people have to have a procedure that says, okay, if we're going to merge a record in Salesforce, we also have to do something in the other system, otherwise it will recreate one of those records. Depends how the sync works. So I think it's important to think through those edge cases and know how it behaves.
Yeah, and after getting all persnickety and high and mighty, I will also add to my own comments and say that there's no perfect tool for this. And, the art and science of integrations in some ways is determining how much of it is going to be science and how much of it is going to be art that you are working with your data. And that's where you get into concepts like technical debt, because if you put something automated into Salesforce technical debt, if you don't disintegrate it, if you leave it separate, there is some trade-offs in all directions, and I've not seen one tool ever handle all of these circumstances perfectly, no matter how well designed and how well intentioned.
And it's certainly been my experience that often that the other system is less sophisticated than Salesforce is with things like duplicates and merges. I've been working with an organization that's brought information from an external ticketing system, and it's been one of the hardest things is dealing with the duplicates because the external ticketing system created them all the time. And while we could have had all of the duplicates in Salesforce, of course, we've got the tools to be able to merge, and it's what you do then. We've had a lot of times where precisely that scenario that Matthew mentioned a few minutes ago has happened, which is that it's a bit like kind of painting a bridge, is like, because constantly the new duplicates are, the new duplicates being created in Salesforce because the ticketing system looks for that ID and it's no longer there, and so creates a new record. So I think Peter, definitely having that sort of transition, that there's some kind of place where you can put things and then figure out how they need to be processed is the smart way to do this.
Right, because I've had exactly that problem with doing salsa integrations, which really I don't like doing very much. But for my sins, I've built them, and that's exactly the approach I ended up taking because of that issue you're raising, which was, so I bring the data in, say the supporter data from Salsa, and maybe I bring in the donations in a separate query. But what would happen in Salsa is someone would be in there, they would come to the page, it would maybe pre-populate, and it would end up creating a dupe. So it would be two different supporter keys in Salsa, but the same email address. Yep. And then they would come into Salesforce, and Salesforce would get very flustered by that. It'd be like, whoa, no, what's going on here? So the approach I took was exactly that, which was I'd move it all into a staging table, leave the transactions in the staging table, and then as new stuff comes in, I'm like, no, that transaction has already been processed. And so I can kind of handle it in Salesforce and just say, look, you just give me the data of this staging table. Then I'm going to say, no, ignore that record because I know it's a dupe, or no, or flag it and say, no, wait, that's already, and that way I can kind of again, I run a batch that processes the 90% of the work, and then the 10% or the 5% I flag and say, right, but I keep in track. So when the integration runs tomorrow, it's setting the same transactions. They're already marked as processed, so I don't end up rerunning them, recreating them. So it's kind of like I can create my kind of workflow queue, process it, and then, so maybe I go back a week and keep pulling the transactions in, but that way I can kind of hold that logic in Salesforce and say, no, I've already dealt with this dude. I don't need. Whereas if you just kind of say, well, I'm going to take the data in each night, but then something changes and then that supporter comes back in, then you're kind of having to just you end up going around circles, drive yourself crazy. So that's why I'm a fan of those staging concepts for those sort of integrations where where there's going to be some transformation. Then you could kind of say, no, I've done it, I've flagged it, it's complete. I don't need to worry about it again.
Because that also helps.
Yeah, very subtle.
I was just going to say that it also helps as well, where the structure of the incoming data is a little different to Salesforce. It's not just a good way of dealing with duplicates, is it? It's a good way of actually these two structures don't quite match. So how are we going to resolve that?
Yeah, and that's that old problem of like, Salsa is a tool that everybody wants to integrate, and guess what? It has a terrible API. The data table structure is, limiting inside of itself, let alone getting information out of those data tables. And, you kind of have to just work with what's there sometimes. And a lot of times, like, you are limited by the third-party tool that you are using for that exact reason. I could go on about Salsa, but I'm not going to.
Well, that maybe leads us into. I was asking the panel to think about their favorite and least favorite integrations, so that they could talk about them a bit. I'm just going to briefly, if anyone has any questions about any of the things that we've been talking about, specifically about the integrations. And Matthew, I'd love it if you could find a link to, because you and your colleagues wrote some fantastic blog posts about assessing integrations and kind of things to watch out for. And if you could post a couple of links in the chat for everybody, that would be great. So, sure. Yeah. So if we've been talking a bit in the generality, since we don't work for Salesforce, or we don't really work for any of these companies. I know there's your relationship with Peter, but do you have, each of you, do you have an example of an integration, somebody who you think has done this really well and smartly? It could be yourself. And do you have examples of integrations where you'd kind of give people advice? Be careful of this, because this is not necessarily a smart way to do it. Matthew, should we start with you? Do you have a particular integration that you like?
Well, yeah.
Of course.
Well, the one we like when it comes to email is Campaign Monitor.
Yep.
We have become huge fans of their Salesforce integration. I mean, it's a good email tool in and of itself, but in our opinion, we have another blog post about this, which I can dig up in a minute, but in our opinion, it's got by far the best Salesforce integration, and got a lot of happy clients using it now. It's great.
And are they good at that? What we were talking about, this whole issue of duplicates and things like that. Are you going to?
I don't. One of my partners is more clued in on some of the nuts and bolts of the integration. I don't know exactly. I think it is keyed to the email address, but I don't know. I could find out.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is it contact centric, or is it email centric? It's more and more, I think, email. People are starting to realize that people have multiple emails, or like having multiple emails for different circumstances. So I think people are starting to realize that they need to have a contact account with email relationship.
I can find out the answer to that. I may even be able to find out while we're in this chat. But so that's the one we really like for email. I mean, it just, compared to many of the others, it simply works. It does what you expect. It allows you to get the basic things done that you want to get done, which is to send email to people that you have defined in a list in Salesforce and not have it be something that makes you tear your hair out. It also has good automation in terms of like having automated drip campaigns and stuff that go up. So it's great. Another thing that we like that someone else that you mentioned, Bryn, is form assembly. For anyone out there who's not using form assembly, it's a little more do-it-yourself, right? By the nature of it, form assembly is something for making forms that you put up on your website that people fill out and data comes to you, and it has a really great tool set for controlling how exactly you want that data to come in, and it's one of the more sophisticated we've seen in terms of how flexible, how much control it gives you of how exactly that data comes in. So you can do a ton just with their point and click tools that make you not have to post-process the data nearly as much or at all in Salesforce. So it can save you time writing code in Salesforce, save you time building hairy process builder things, and it's great.
May I ask, because I had to, when I built out, of course, limited knowledge of form assembly when I did this, but when I built out the form assembly, I had to put in the logic of how to, to check for the email when it came in, to check for all the emails, whatever. But does form assembly come pre-canned with, or can help me build out logic when I want to bring in a person's contact information, like figuring out if the account exists, and if it doesn't, to create it, and then to append the contact record to that newly created account if it needed to do that, instead of me having to try to figure out how to build that out?
I believe you can do all those things. I'm not 100% sure about exactly what options it gives you for checking for an existing account, but I believe you can check for an existing record and then either fill in a lookup field either based on that record or create a new one. But I believe you can do that.
All right, yeah, because the reason we went with the household one was because we were able to just only have to check for the email, and then it would be smart enough to fall back on the NPSP auto creation of the household account if it had to.
Right.
But yes, you can choose how you look up an object, and whether you simply look up a record ID or whether you update or create a new object. You can control that, and you can also choose what order those objects get looked at. So whether you start with the account or you start with the contact. I'm with you, Matthew. I think form assembly is the connecting tool is the thing that really kind of distinguishes it from some of the other form building apps, and the sophistication that you can do with that.
Yeah, and the order and doing the multiple different lookup loops based on, I was a fan when I did it. It's just that as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, all right, I'm going to have to rebuild these forms away from the household account structure most likely, and I was kind of dreading it because I'm like doing that lookup of the account and figuring it out and all that stuff. So.
Got it.
So Matthew, there's a request if you could post about Campaign Monitor and maybe a link to their site or something.
We have a blog. Yeah, we have a blog post all about it. So let me find that.
If you'd like to add that. So Peter, how about some of your favorites, or a favorite or a least favorite, and perhaps could you speak then to Dennis's question, which is if you're trying to do a custom integration, what sort of skills do you need? I think my recommendation, Dennis, is you should go and talk to somebody like Peter, but to say.
So first thing, I'm old school. I still love the Excel connector. I think it sadly is going to end soon because of TLS integration. But if I'm doing any small scale data integration, I reckon I use that tool more than any other integration tool.
That's being
still
kind of not absonified, ex-author. This is the people who are moving into that space now.
right. I don't think, and I'm sure they all do things much better than. But the Excel connector I still think is, with my usual caveat, with great power comes great responsibility. I think in terms of to Dennis's question, and then also as a general comment, I think the most fun for me as a developer, the most fun integration is when the other side has a great API. So if you've ever done work with Stripe, Stripe has this fantastic API. I mean, they built from the ground up, they built a great API, and you can do all sorts of weird and wonderful things because of that. So that's those sort of more modern, things that have been built recently. They've built a really solid REST API into it. It's really exciting when you first fire something up. I think the two big things when I'm doing integrations like that are how good is the API and what's the authorization process. We haven't really talked about that, but with integrations, the biggest challenge often when people say, hey, let's integrate these two systems, is like, all right, how are we going to authenticate? How does system A know how's this allowed to talk to Salesforce? Are you going to use OAuth? Are you going to use a user login? Are you going to do it anonymously? So some things like Form Assembly take care of those, but you want to do more complex integrations. Either Salesforce has got to request the data gate, or the other system has to be given the access into the system. And that could be fraught with challenges. And that, honestly, to Dennis's point, that's often the most difficult piece of the integration. So Salesforce has a great REST API. Salesforce has its old SOAP API. But in the end of the day, you can use even the out-the-box without any custom code is still pretty challenging. But also just the authentication piece, I think, is where a lot of people get kind of, unless if you're building your own, that's where a lot of people, I think, get confused. If you look at DevBoard, Stack Exchange, it's like, well, where do I store that? And how do I store that? And how do I make that work? And so, yeah, I think. But I mean, so in terms of just setting up the ability, like for example, the authorized.net piece that I've written for somebody, actually just building a class that can receive an input from authorized.net takes about 5 minutes. It's not that difficult. But setting up all the other pieces around it, setting up the test script, setting up the deployment, all that piece, and getting it right, and then getting the security behind it right, that's a lot more complicated. And I think, and again, to the point we made earlier that I was making and Tracy was making, is that with any integration, I can get System A to talk to Salesforce in probably a pretty short time. I then spend the next 90% of my time working out what to do when it doesn't work. And error handling is complex. Well, at least it's complex.
Great. That's really good advice for everybody, I think. So, Tracy, do you have a kind of a favorite integration or a more kind of words of warning?
I think what's funny is I've kind of learned the hard way that when I start naming names in our ecosystem, I inevitably get phone calls. So I think I'm going to sidestep naming names, but what I will say are two things to bear in mind regarding integrations in general. There's a lot of free integration tools on the App Exchange. I integrate from Salesforce to X external system, whatever that is, an events tool, an email tool, or whatever. And I think, to Peter's point about the robustness, for lack of a better term, of the integration, with the free tools, you get what you pay for. And the reason why some of these tools are paid integration tools is because they've put a developer team behind considering all of the possible permutations of what happens when that data is moving back and forth, and record deletions and global opt-outs versus specific opt-outs, and all of that. So the first thing I'd say is with free stuff, you do get what you pay for, and sometimes that's just what it is. And the paid stuff is sometimes worth paying for so that you don't have to think about the kinds of things you have to think about when you're using the free stuff. The second point that I would say is that not all integrations are alike, but one of the criteria by which I look at a tool in this day and age is actually how invested are the tool's developers in the nonprofit ecosystem and its success. Because I know more and more in our industry, there's a lot of people who are looking to come in and say, we work with nonprofits, we know nonprofits, we do nonprofits, we've heard of the Nonprofit Starter Pack, and I think, you know, there's a difference between saying that and actually having a track record of community participation and having a track record of listening to the specific industry needs of the nonprofit industry as held against the rest of Salesforce landia, for lack of a better term. So I do believe that the best integrations are those where either the developer in specific or the company behind them, you know, has a presence in our industry, has a presence in our ecosystem, and spends time listening to users do become some of the best integrations in our industry, because that's, to me, the criteria that demonstrates by which they care.
Great, thank you. I have just been fending off somebody who was trying to walk into this room and turn off the Wi-Fi. But however, since we only have 3 minutes to go, that's great. It's the end of the conference, you see, they're starting to pack up. So that's fine. They were just about to cut me off. But there we go. So I think unless we have any final questions, I think we may start to wrap up. I'll start to wrap up if anyone wants to try and get something in. This has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much for your inputs. And it's interesting because I think we have talked in a more general way, perhaps more generally than we often do on office hours. We often get much more specific, but then it was a more general topic. So thank you very much for your inputs. I do recommend that if you haven't picked up those blog posts that Matthew's posted, do try and grab those from chat before we go offline, or otherwise go to Percolator Consulting and look for their blog. Thank you very much indeed to Matthew, to Peter, to Tracy for sharing your thoughts and experience. We will be back with office hours next Friday. It'll just be a regular session, so you can bring your questions and answers on any topic. Otherwise, thank you very much indeed, everybody, and have a really great weekend. Enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.